Welcome to the deep dive. We sort through complex research so you don't have to, bringing you the key ideas.
Exactly.
Today we're tackling something pretty fundamental. Those really big economic downturns, the crashes, what's really going on underneath.
It's a question we got from one of you, actually, someone we're calling the learner. And it's fascinating because the common answers aren't always the whole story.
Right. You often hear about, some external shock, a crisis somewhere else triggering it all.
But what if the potential for these disasters, it's actually built into our economic systems? That's the really crucial idea we're digging into.
And our main source for this is an academic paper, Endogenous Disasters, by Petrosky, Nadeau, Zhang, and Kuhn. Endogenous, that's the key word, meaning from within.
Mhm.
So our mission really is to unpack their argument. It's a bit counterintuitive that standard economic models, the kind economists use all the time, can actually, well, generate these severe collapses internally.
Not just react to outside events, but create the conditions for a crash themselves. It's quite a claim.
Yeah, we want to break that down for you, make it clear without getting bogged down in, excessive jargon.
So maybe we start where the paper starts. It points out that sometimes traditional models don't fully explain just how deep some recessions get or why recovery can be so slow. Think about the Great Recession, 2007, 2009.
Right. The standard stories sometimes feel like they're missing something. This paper offers, like you said, an internal view.
Exactly. And the foundation they build on is a well-known framework, the Diamond-Mortenson-Pesserides model, the DMP model.
Okay, DMP. Sounds technical, but what's the basic idea?
Well, it's essentially a model of the job market. Think of it as a way to understand how companies with open positions find people who are looking for work.
Like a matching process. Firms post jobs.
Yep. Firms post vacancies saying, we need someone, and unemployed workers are out there searching. The DMP model focuses on how that matching actually happens and what makes it efficient or inefficient.
Okay, things like how many jobs there are versus how many people are looking, right?
Precisely. Yeah. And how easy it is for firms to actually find and hire the right person.
So here's the twist then. The researchers took this standard DMP model and analyzed it using some pretty powerful mathematical tools, a globally nonlinear algorithm, they call it.
Which basically means they looked at the model's behavior very, very carefully across all sorts of potential situations, not just assuming the economy hums along nicely near some stable point.
And what popped out of that analysis?
This is the core finding. The model itself, without needing some big external disaster imposed on it, started producing these rare but really severe economic downturns. Crashes, basically.
Wow.
Yeah, similar in scale to the kinds of historical events people like Reitz and Barrows studied. So the key takeaway is these aren't just external shocks hitting a stable system. The potential for disaster arises endogenously from within the model's own logic.
Okay, so the system itself has this potential instability. That's a big idea. What inside the model makes this happen? What are the ingredients?
They really highlight two main things. The first one is something called wage inertia.
Wage inertia. Okay, what's that about? Sticky wages.
Kind of, yeah. It's the idea that wages often don't fall very quickly or very much, even when the economy gets hit by bad news.
Which makes intuitive sense, right? Workers resist pay cuts, and firms might worry about morale if they slash wages.
Exactly. People don't like earning less, and companies know cutting pay can mean losing good people or just having a really unhappy workforce.
So how does that stickiness, that inertia, feed into the possibility of a disaster in their model?
Well, the paper links it to another concept in the model, the flow value of unemployment activities. Let's call it B.
B.
Think of B as capturing everything that makes being unemployed, well, less awful.
Right.
Includes unemployment benefits, sure, but also the value of time spent doing other things, home repairs, childcare, even just leisure.
So it's not just the government check, it's the broader value of not being at that specific job.
Right. And the argument, drawing on work by others like Hagedorn and Manosky, is that if this B value is relatively high, if unemployment isn't seen as a complete catastrophe, then there's less downward pressure on wages when the economy turns down.
Ah, okay. If being unemployed isn't the absolute worst case scenario because of B, workers have less reason to accept big wage cuts and wages stay stickier.
Exactly. Now think about what happens in bad times. Overall economic output is falling.
Right.
But if wages don't fall much or fall more slowly than output, what happens to company profits?
They get squeezed, really squeezed. Less money coming in, but the wage bill stays relatively high.
Precisely. Falling output plus sticky wages equals shrinking profits. And that's a crucial driver in their model.
And they found historical parallels for this, like in the Great Depression.
They did. They point to studies looking at the U.S., France, Germany, Italy back then. The evidence suggests that wages often didn't fall fast enough, especially when prices were also falling deflation.
So in real terms, wages might have even gone up sometimes.
In some cases, yes. Which, you can imagine, made things even tougher for businesses trying to keep people employed when their revenues were plummeting. It created this vicious cycle.
Okay, so ingredient 1, sticky wages, squeezing profits in bad times. What's the second key ingredient they highlight? Something about hiring costs.
Yes. Rigid hiring costs due to trading externality. It sounds a bit academic, but the idea is important.
Break it down for us. Trading externality.
It refers to what happens when one side of the market, say, job seekers, massively outnumbers the other side job openings. Think deep recession.
Okay, loads of unemployed people, very few vacancies.
Right. Now, for any one firm wanting to hire, they might fill their single opening relatively quickly because there are so many candidates. But here's the externality. If a new firm decides to post one more vacancy, it barely makes a dent in the overall chances of other firms filling their vacancies.
Because the pool of job seekers is just so vast compared to the number of jobs, adding one more drop to the ocean doesn't change much for the other drops.
That's a good way to put it. There's a bottleneck on the worker side. This leads to an asymmetry.
Asymmetry how?
In good times, when jobs are plentiful and workers are scarce, hiring costs, finding, interviewing, training someone can go up fast as firms compete.
Sure, bidding war for talent.
But in bad times, even with tons of available workers, these hiring costs don't seem to fall nearly as much. There's a downward rigidity.
So costs go up easily, but they're sticky coming down. Why? Why don't costs plummet when labor is abundant?
The paper points to things like fixed costs associated with matching. Think about the HR department's time. Interviews, background checks, onboarding paperwork.
Stuff you have to do for every hire, regardless of the economy.
Exactly. These fixed costs, as people like Pissarides have discussed, put a floor under hiring expenses. They don't fall enough to really encourage firms to start hiring aggressively again, even when profits are squeezed and there are lots of potential workers.
And this rigidity is something that emerges from the search model itself.
Yes. Unlike in Simply models, where these frictions might not be present, it's an outcome of how the job market functions in their framework.
Okay, let's put it together. We have wages that resist falling, squeezing profits. And we have hiring costs that also resist falling, discouraging new job creation. How do these two interact to cause a potential disaster?
It's the combination. Imagine a big negative shock hits. Profits are already under pressure from sticky wages.
Right.
Then you'd hope lower hiring costs might encourage firms to post vacancies anyway. But they don't fall enough because of that rigidity we just talked about.
So the incentive to hire just isn't there.
It gets severely suppressed. Job creation stalls. Meanwhile, job destruction layoffs might continue or even increase as firms struggle.
And the result?
Aggregate employment just falls off a cliff, as they put it. You get a rapid, severe contraction. A disaster generated by the interaction of these internal labor market features.
That's quite a mechanism. The labor market's own workings creating this vulnerability.
It really paints a picture of potential inherent instability.
But how well does this theoretical story match up with reality? Did they test this against actual historical data?
They did. That's crucial. They calibrated the model, meaning they set its parameters using real-world data. They look at historical episodes of large drops in output and consumption across many countries over a long period, drawing on data compiled by Barrow and Ursua.
So data on actual economic disasters?
Yes. And they also used U.S. unemployment data going way back, including the Great Depression, to make sure the model's labor market dynamics looked realistic.
And the comparison. How did the model's simulated disasters stack up against the real ones?
Pretty well, actually. The average size of the output drops in their simulated disasters was about 22%. That's remarkably close to the average size found in the historical data.
Wow. Okay.
And the probability of a disaster happening in the model was around 5%. The historical data showed about 7.8% after adjusting for long-term growth trends. So it's definitely in the same ballpark.
That adjustment for growth seems important. They're looking for the unusual deviations, not just slow growth.
Exactly. It makes the comparison more rigorous. They also found similar agreement for consumption disasters.
And did the model get other things right, too? Like just general economic fluctuations?
Broadly, yes.
Yeah.
It did a reasonable job of matching things like the overall volatility of output and consumption, the average unemployment rate, how much unemployment fluctuates, and even some finer details about the distribution of unemployment, its skewness and kurtosis, meaning its tendency towards extreme values.
So it wasn't just getting the disasters right. It has some general realism.
Right. They also showed it could generate a realistic-looking beverage curve, that inverse relationship between unemployment and job vacancies we often see.
Okay, that adds weight to it. Now, you mentioned they did robustness checks, testing if the results were just a fluke of their specific setup.
Yeah, they tried tweaking the model in several ways to see if the disaster mechanism held up.
Like what?
Well, they added home production,
Mm.
the idea that people produce value at home, even if unemployed. They played with how substitutable home goods were for market goods. The disaster still happened. They also added capital accumulation machines, equipment, investment. That changed some details about investment and consumption patterns, naturally, but the core dynamics for employment and output disasters remained largely intact.
Interesting. So adding investment didn't fundamentally change the labor market story.
It seems not in their setup, and they even tried different assumptions about people's preferences, specifically how they feel about risk and timing, using something called recursive utility, which is often used in finance. Again, the disaster dynamics persisted.
So the finding seems pretty, well, robust. It wasn't just dependent on one very specific set of assumptions.
That's the takeaway from those checks, yes. It suggests the core mechanism is quite fundamental to the model.
So stepping back, what's the big picture implication here? If economies can sort of generate their own disasters from within the labor market, how does that change how we should think?
I think the main shift is broadening our perspective. It suggests we can't only look for external culprits, banking crises elsewhere, oil shocks, pandemics when big downturns happen.
We also need to look inward at the structure of our own labor markets.
Exactly. The inherent dynamics, like the stickiness of wages and the rigidity of hiring costs, might themselves create vulnerabilities that can amplify shocks or even generate downturns somewhat independently.
Does the paper suggest where research should go next with this idea?
It does. The authors mention a few key areas. One is integrating monetary factors, money supply changes, interest rates. Figures like Friedman and Schwartz argue these were crucial in events like the Great Depression.
Makes sense. Money matters.
Another is financial frictions, difficulties getting loans, credit market problems. Bernanke and others have stressed how these can pour fuel on the fire during crises.
Right, the financial system interacting with the real economy.
And finally, they point towards studying optimal policy. If these risks are inherent, what can policymakers actually do to make the system more resilient? How can we design policies to mitigate the chances or severity of these endogenous disasters?
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. The core message from this deep dive, the key insight for you, our listener, from the Petrosky-Nadeau, Zhang, and Kuhn paper,
Is that even our standard ways of modeling the economy, when you really push them and analyze them deeply, can show us something quite startling. Market economies might have an inherent tendency to generate severe downturns.
not just from outside hits, but from the inside out, driven by how labor markets work, wages not adjusting smoothly, hiring costs being sticky downwards.
Yeah, it suggests the potential for major trouble might be partly baked into the system's mechanics.
Which gives you, hopefully, a valuable shortcut to understanding a really complex but important piece of modern macroeconomics, a different lens.
Definitely a different lens.
And that leads to our final thought for you to chew on. If these risks are partly internal, partly endogenous, what does that mean for policy? What are the smartest ways to build more resilience into the system itself, to maybe counteract these inherent tendencies?
It's a huge question.
It is. If this sparked your interest, definitely check out the research we mentioned. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.